Prometheus is a contentious movie, and it's not too hard to see why. It's a prequel to one of the greatest monster movies ever, but it doesn't feature that movie's monster. Instead, it features these goofy-looking engineers. So rather than an origin story about the xenomorph, it's an origin story about humanity. And that story, to say the least, is problematic. Not just from an evolutionary standpoint, but from a narrative one as well. Prometheus asks lots of questions it never answers. It has characters who don't always display the greatest intelligence, and it's written in a way that's just clunky, lurching from one ill-conceived construct to the next. Now, in spite of these issues, I actually like the movie, yet I'll gladly concede it could have been better. And having watched it several times, I'm convinced that in order to be better, it really only needed to change one thing. It needed to fix its biggest problem. But which of its problems is the biggest? Which one does the most damage? Which one, if addressed, would have the greatest positive impact? In regards to the film's premise, that we were created during a kind of ritualistic science experiment gone wrong, it may be ridiculous, not to mention biologically impossible, but that doesn't mean it hurts the film. Some of our most beloved stories have ridiculous premises, and that doesn't stop us from enjoying them. As Roger Ebert was fond of saying, don't judge a film by what it's about, but by how it is about it. In other words, judge a story not by its subject, but by how it's told. So the issue with Prometheus is not the premise. But what about all this ambiguity? The film poses lots of questions that remain mostly unanswered at its conclusion. Yet while that's undoubtedly true, the case that these unanswered questions actually harm the story isn't so open and shut. Let's look at the example of why David poisons Charlie. Was he programmed to? Did Weyland instruct him to? Or does David have his own agenda? This is never made clear, and some people find that frustrating. But they shouldn't, because the answer doesn't matter. David's actions remind me a little of Hal, the computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, who kills his entire crew with the exception of one. Though there is an explanation as to why Hal does this, you don't need to know it in order to enjoy the film. When you're given enough information to decide for yourself, concrete answers can be unnecessary or even detrimental. As Voltaire once put it, the best way to be boring is to leave nothing out. Now, I'm not saying that concrete answers are always bad, or that all cases of ambiguity are always good. As to why the engineers left maps on Earth that led back to their weapons facility, I wouldn't have minded a solid explanation. Unlike David's poisoning of Charlie, where we can make an educated guess as to why, here we can't because we aren't given enough information. As a result, this isn't fun to wonder about, it's just frustrating. And that for me is the crux of the issue regarding the film's ambiguity, whether there's more of the good kind than the bad. And I think there is, particularly when you take into consideration that the story centers around an existential question that doesn't have a satisfying answer, so the film isn't obliged to give us one. Moving on to whether the characters are stupid or not, they are, incredibly. They take their helmets off on an alien planet, the guy in charge of mapping manages to get lost, this guy tries to play with a clearly aggressive alien snake, Vickers dies in a way that is unintentionally hilarious, and Charlie, who is a scientist, after literally seeing a worm in his eye, decides the best course of action is to do nothing.
Oh my God, you're sick.
I'm okay, baby.
This is the same guy who gets all pouty about finding no living engineers, even though his theory that the engineers created humans is proven correct, which would be up there with the greatest scientific discoveries ever, and even though there's still plenty left to explore, they only just got here. And don't even get me started on how little interest or wonder these characters show towards their never-before-seen surroundings.
Nobody's home.
So as to whether the characters are stupid, yeah, they are. And as to whether their stupidity hurts the film, yeah, it does. But as to whether this is the film's biggest problem, no, I don't think it is. For one, not all the characters are stupid, it's mainly these four. And for two, their stupidity usually serves the story. Go back to this scene with the alien snake. Poor execution aside, this does show us something new about the world the characters are in. If Fifield wasn't dumb enough to get lost, we wouldn't have seen the snake. And if Milburn wasn't dumb enough to try and play with the thing, we wouldn't have seen just how dangerous it is. So the problem here is more about why rather than what. It's like when some idiot in a horror movie runs upstairs instead of just going out the front door. If they actually did go out the front door, the movie wouldn't be scary anymore. So the problem isn't with what they do, but with why they do it. It's not Fifield getting lost that's stupid, it's that he's not given a good reason to get lost, considering no one else does. Just like Milburn isn't given a good reason to go from being too scared to continue to suddenly turning into Steve Irwin.
Woo! You're alright, mate. Come on now.
It's not that they're stupid, which characters are of course allowed to be, it's that they're inconsistently stupid, which has more to do with the fourth complaint against the film, its clunky writing. Now for the record, I think the basic story of Prometheus is good. It's an interesting setup that's delivered in the form of an archetype we're well familiar with. A team of explorers in a remote location trying to unravel a mystery that we the audience want to see them solve. And leading the way are two compelling characters. Ellie may be a flawed protagonist, but she's still a good one. She's actually smart. She's curious, which is the driving driving force of the story, she's brave, she's relentless, and she's resourceful. Consider how differently she reacts to learning she's been infected than Charlie did. Instead of acting like everything's fine, she tries to take immediate action, and when David stops her, she doesn't give up, she finds another way. This entire sequence of her learning she's been infected, escaping to the surgery pod, saving herself just before she's killed, then collapsing before a clearly surprised David is my favorite part of the movie. I think it's worth watching just for this scene alone. And David is an excellent antagonist. Whereas Ellie's compassionate towards others, David is devoid of compassion, viewing others as disposable and seeming to derive a sort of sadistic pleasure from the pain he causes them. And whereas Ellie is only human, which limits her both physically and mentally, David possesses a strength and intelligence that Ellie cannot hope to match. But David is more than just a great foil for Ellie. He's fascinating all by himself. He seems genuinely intrigued by the engineers and by what they are up to, and despite being an android, he remains emotionally vulnerable, particularly when it comes to him not being human. As Weyland points out, he possesses gifts a person could only dream of, but lacks the ability to appreciate them, a comment David clearly didn't appreciate, probably because he knows it's true. So it's not the main story that hurts the film, or a lack of compelling characters. Instead, it's things like having the wrong kind of ambiguity, inconsistent character stupidity, and blatant foreshadowing. For instance, Ellie is incapable of becoming pregnant.
I can't create life.
Then she becomes pregnant with an alien. Yannick says he'll do whatever it takes to protect Earth.
I can't bring none of that shit back home with us.
Then he has to sacrifice himself to save Earth. Ellie loses her father to an infection he contracted in the jungle, then she loses Charlie to an infection that David gave him. This last one isn't really foreshadowing since we don't learn about Ellie's father until after Charlie dies.
To lose Dr. Holloway after your father died under such similar circumstances.
So it's more foreshadowing in reverse, but it's still clunky as hell and completely unnecessary. Would Charlie's death be less tragic to Ellie if her father hadn't died in a similar manner? Would Ellie's alien impregnation somehow be less horrific if she was perfectly fertile? Would Yannick's sacrifice somehow be less heroic if he hadn't previously pledged to protect Earth? Now, to be fair, the film does get the foreshadowing right with the introduction of the surgery pod. You can't miss it, yet it's subtle enough that afterwards you don't immediately think to yourself that someone's definitely going to have an alien abortion here later. But when foreshadowing smacks you in the face like this, it not only robs the story of tension by telling you what's going to happen, it just feels condescending. The film's repeated attempts to meld science with Christianity are also poorly executed and completely unnecessary.
Guess you can take your father's cross off now.
Where's my cross?
Even after all this, you still believe, don't you?
Does it matter that the story takes place during Christmas vacation, something made reference to exactly twice? Once in the beginning when Yannick decorates a small tree,
It's Christmas.
and again at the end when Ellie says,
It is New Year's Day, the year of our Lord.
would the story change at all if it took place over the summer? Does it matter that Ellie uses the same line her father used to justify his belief in heaven?
Because that's what I choose to believe.
To justify her theory about the engineers?
But it's what I choose to believe.
I have no problem with her being both a scientist and a woman of faith, but again, it's all about subtlety. Instead of bashing audiences over the head with this stuff, the film would have been better served by letting people make these connections for themselves. So similar to the character stupidity complaint, the clunky writing critique is both warranted and it hurts the story. But does that mean it's the biggest problem, or is it merely a symptom of that problem? You've probably guessed by now that of this list I gave you, the answer is none of the above. Instead, what really hurts the film is that it's trying to do too much. Prometheus has 8 separate storylines, and of those only 2 are good, the ones belonging to its 2 main characters. This is because when you're watching either David or Ellie, you're watching the actual plot, which again is pretty good. But when neither is on screen, you're watching a subplot of which there's 6, one for each of these 6 supporting characters, all of whom have their own storyline and all of which are poorly executed. That's the real problem with Prometheus. It has too many subplots. Now that may not sound very different from the clunky writing complaint. You could argue that the 2 are one and the same, and that if the subplots were better developed, they would turn out fine. But that gets the problem backwards. Prometheus is already over 2 hours long. Adding to that runtime just to develop the subplots would accomplish the opposite of what a subplot is supposed to do: support the main story without detracting from it. Once you accept the time constraints these subplots faced, then their lackluster execution becomes easier to understand. This is how you wind up with the guy in charge of mapping being the one who gets lost, or how one character being revealed as another character's father is something no one cares about. And whereas trying to address one of these issues would be limited in scope, fixing the subplots would improve the movie as a whole. But even if Jon Spaihts and Damon Lindelof had identified this problem before handing their script off to Ridley Scott, how could they have fixed it? How could they have improved the subplots without adding to the movie's runtime? The answer, obviously, is they needed to get rid of some first, and that's what we're going to do now. We're going to drop the subplots that don't matter to the main story. The ones that do matter, though, we're going to hold on to. So as much as I'd love to get rid of Charlie, who I find insufferable, we can't because he matters too much to the plot. Him getting infected by David and then in turn infecting Ellie is what sets up the best scene in the film. We're going to hold on to Yannick and Weyland as well. Weyland's desire to live forever fits with the Promethean theme of the story, and Yannick's sacrifice is a redeeming counterpunch to Weyland's selfishness. Fifield, Milburn, and Vickers, on the other hand, serve no crucial roles, though I like this opening scene of Vickers that perfectly establishes her character, and though I like this one of her and David where her hatred of him was palpable, as Weyland points out, Vickers has no reason to even be here, and the response she gives, that she didn't want to wait around to see who was in charge of his company, makes no sense. And while Fifield and Milburn do lead us to the alien snake, which shows us something new about the world the characters are in, the snake is only in this one scene, and removing that scene doesn't really affect the plot, aside from it preventing Fifield from turning into a Frankenmonster, which the film is better off without anyway. Just by getting rid of these three characters, we've greatly reduced the two most valid complaints against the film, and we've freed up time to develop the subplots we've kept. The easiest one to fix is Charlie's, because we don't need to add any new scenes with him. We just need to fix the ones he's already in so he's less annoying. Specifically, before the first exploration, he needs to dial it back, and afterwards he needs to stop pouting so much.
I wanted to talk to him.
And we'll just get rid of this scene where he sees a worm in his eye and does nothing. That way he won't realize he's sick until it's too late. Moving on to Weyland and Yannick, the problem with both is they're too peripheral, so their respective fates in the end don't have the emotional impact they should. With Weyland, the obvious fix is to not have him spend most of the film hidden away, something that never made any sense to begin with. Why would he need to hide on his own ship? The only thing he needs to conceal are his true intentions. Until then, he can act like a benevolent grandfather, taking part in one last adventure and encouraging everyone else along the way. And to reveal his sinister nature, he could show up when Ellie's sedated and pleading for help to tell her she's about to make another great contribution to science, the donation of her body. As for Yannick, rather than staying behind on the ship, he needs to take part in the first exploration. Why not have him be the one in charge of mapping instead of Fifield? This way, when he discovers that what they've been exploring is actually a ship, it will have a more cohesive build-up. It's a problem he works on that he eventually solves. This will also be the case with his revelation that the planet they're on is a weapons depot.
You know what this place is? It's an installation. Maybe even military.
We should see the process of how he came to that conclusion. So what if Yannick is alerted that the mapping of the ship is finished when David opens this door that allows the scanning puffs to go through? Yannick would realize David must have gone off on his own, and though David turns off his video feed, Yannick could turn it back on with some sort of captain's override. Then he could see through David's camera just how much of the alien virus the engineers had manufactured and put two and two together. I actually wish the film had kept this deleted scene with the engineer, in which Weyland explains why he thinks he deserves to live forever.
You see this man, and I made him in my own image, sir. You and I, we are superior. We are gods, and gods never die.
But I would change the engineer's response and have him say that they weren't trying to create humans in this opening sequence, they were trying to create more engineers, which is the only way their species can procreate. But they failed, they're slowly going extinct, and all they can create now is death. He'd go on his rampage, Ellie would run for Prometheus, but this time, Yannick would take off before she got there, saying he knows where the engineer is headed and he's going to stop him. He'd jettison the lifeboat for Ellie, smash into the engineer, and the rest of the movie would play out basically the same. The end. By getting rid of the subplots that don't matter and developing the ones that do, the story becomes a lot more focused. Now that's not to say that we've made the story perfect by any stretch. It still makes no sense that the engineer language is the root language of all humans, or that a primitive cave painting could somehow lead to a planet 35 light years from Earth, or that Ellie's dreams are not only perfectly coherent, but that she dreams of herself in the third person, or that the engineers, whose technology is far superior to ours, start their three-dimensional mapping system by blowing on a flute. Anyway, that's my take on the real problem with Prometheus and how to fix it. If you agree or disagree or have any other thoughts on the matter, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.